The reading is from Jonah, chapter 1, page 928. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. This is the word of the Lord.
Hello, good morning. My name is Lou, not Holy Mother. Just want to nip that one in the bud right now, okay? So, today we start our new series of the term, and we are in the book of Jonah. Now, you might think that you're fairly familiar with this story. You might even be thinking, have I accidentally come to an early bird service? Is she about to whip out a giant puppet of a whale? Tempting as that is, and you know that I would, I've got news for you. Jonah is not about a fish. The fish gets mentioned in a total of 2 verses in the entire book, so don't get distracted by the fish. Now, I know that may be shocking, or maybe even disappointing for some of you, but we have a problem here because most of you will know Jonah as a picture book that you've read to your children. Maybe it's had a slightly watered down, bland moral message attached to it. The modern writers have conveniently airbrushed out Jonah's suicidal moments, his anger at God, the fact that he is a really unlikable character. He is the villain of the story. The man of God in this story is the bad guy. So as we travel with Jonah on his story, the hope is that our eyes are opened to the many other things that are going on in this story. Because Jonah was not written to entertain children or to teach us about fish. The book of Jonah reveals the character of God, his mercy and grace, his purposes through Jesus, and it gets to the heart of our problems. Because unlikely as this may seem, the book of Jonah is actually about us. So don't be surprised if over the coming weeks you have one of those sort of set-piece action movie moments where you feel the sniper's laser beam pointing directly at you. Expect to see yourself in this story. Now, as we are at the start of the book, it falls to me to give a little bit of background and help us understand what we are reading here. So the Bible is like a little library, isn't it? It contains all sorts of different types of literature. You've got poetry, narrative, letters, you've got historical accounts, you've got allegorical accounts. So where does Jonah fit in? Well, the book of Jonah is wonderfully unique. We know that Jonah was a prophet, both by the way he is introduced to us in verse 1, but also because he gets a mention in Kings 2, where he's talked about as ministering to one of the great kings. So we might expect that this book is going to be like other books of the prophets and full of his prophecies. But no, highly unusually, this book is actually about the prophet himself. So we need to ask ourselves, well, what are we reading here? Is this fact or fiction? Is this a historical account of something that actually happened, or is this more of a narrative parable, a story that's written to sort of teach us something? Well, there aren't many clues to go on with this. There's no date mentioned. We're not given the name of the king at the time. It's written in a very different style to lots of the other books. There isn't much here to help us kind of root this story in history. Now, this could have been a deliberate ploy by the author because maybe the story was never intended to be taken literally. Or perhaps the author simply saw no reason to include those details because they're not important. Frankly, we don't know. You can read some very, very long and dusty books on the question, but can we agree for now that whether it's fact or fiction doesn't really matter because the message of the story is the same. What we do know is that this book is beautifully written. It's full of humour and wit and satire and loads of challenge to us, and we are in for quite a ride. So let's take a stroll together through chapter 1 that Dave has just read to us and flesh out some of the details before we then go on to look at the relevance to us today. So straight away in verse 1, we're introduced to Jonah, and the great city of Nineveh. Now, Jonah, we already know he's a prophet, he's a messenger from God, he's also deeply patriotic, and he is a highly partisan nationalist, all of which may have influenced his decision to disobey God and not to go and preach to the Ninevites. More on that later. Because you see, there's some stuff you need to know about Nineveh, and it's pretty unpleasant. The text sort of glosses over the details, simply letting us know that its wickedness has come up before the Lord. These guys were bad. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Hugely powerful, mortal enemies of Israel, they were known for their oppression, injustice, moral degradation, witchcraft, torture. I could go on. Nineveh was a very violent empire, and clearly they were heading for impending doom. Now, we'll explore more about why Jonah didn't do as God asked later in the series, but it's helpful to note at this early stage that until now, prophets had only been sent to go and speak to God's people. This is the first time that a prophet is being sent to leave Israel and to speak to a Gentile city, people that didn't believe in Yahweh, the God. Jonah's message was unprecedented and really unpalatable. Now, it's possible that Jonah was a little bit worried about the Ninevites would skin him alive, pull his tongue from his head, and then put his head on a spike outside the city. He might have been a little bit worried about that. It's also very possible that Jonah didn't think that the Ninevites deserved saving, that they should be outside of the realm of God's grace, face punishment, and that the world would be better off without them. He didn't want them to be saved, and basically, he thought that he knew better than God. Now, as I say, that will all become clearer later in the story, but for now, perhaps it explains why, rather than heading overland to Nineveh, Jonah jumped in a boat and headed to Tarshish in the opposite direction. Now, with any luck, oh yes, I love a map, I'm a geographer. So Tarshish was at the edge of the known world, literally the opposite direction, as far as was humanly possible to go at the time, 2,500 miles away to be exact. Now, I mentioned there was humor in this book, and this is one such moment. It's like the writer is saying, so Jonah got up and went to Timbuktu. And at this point, God could have washed his hands of Jonah. He might have thought, do you know what, this guy is not up to the task. He's a coward, he's disobedient, he's stubborn, he thinks he knows best, he's proud, he's hard-hearted, he's judgmental. Anybody else feeling that sniper's laser beam on them? But God sticks with him. God, who uses flawed characters, who doesn't give up on people, he continues to chase down his man. And he sends a massive storm to get his attention. Now, this must have been a particularly terrifying and spectacular storm. Even the sailors, who would have been quite used to dodgy weather, were very afraid. They were so afraid that they started throwing their cargo overboard into the sea. Now, this was their livelihood that they were throwing overboard. So this is no longer a work trip. There's nothing to be gained from this. This trip has now become about survival. Meanwhile, where is Jonah? In his attempt to hide from God, Jonah has gone below deck. Nice one, Jonah. And he is fast asleep. The man of God is in a literal and spiritual slumber. Back up on deck, the Gentile sailors were praying to every god they could think of. These pagan men were praying to anybody that would listen. They were doing a scattergun approach to prayer. The sailors were looking to the wrong deity for help. Jonah wasn't looking for help at all. So the captain, shocked at Jonah's inexplicable behavior, goes down and shakes him awake and basically begs him to pray, which he still doesn't do. His physical act of running from God and staying silent goes much deeper, and he turns his heart away from God even further. Getting very desperate now, the sailors, who are very aware of the spiritual element of this storm, cast lots to discern the will of the gods and to see who is responsible. Well, God intervenes, and the finger points at Jonah. So they start to question him about his identity, his purpose, his place, his race. Essentially, they want to know, not who are you, but whose are you? And Jonah tells them the truth. I'm a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and dry land. Jonah seems completely blind to the truth of what he's saying, and the irony of it. He's existentially detached. He says he worships the Lord, but is he just paying lip service to God, just going through the motions? The sailors, who were now even more terrified because they knew that this God who made the sea is angry with Jonah, who is on the boat, which is on the sea that this God controls. So they say to Jonah, right, what should be done? What are we going to do? What does Jonah suggest? That they repent? That they pray, maybe? That perhaps they make a sacrifice? Nope. That they kill him. The surest way for him to escape from doing the job that God had sent him to do in Nineveh was to die. Now, to their credit, the sailors, who turn out to be the heroes of this tale, are really uncomfortable with this course of action, and they continue to try to guide the ship to safety. But to no avail. The storm worsens. Finally, at this point, someone prays. But it's not Jonah. The first prayer that this book records is by the non-Israelite pagan sailors, a prayer crying out for forgiveness for what they're about to do. Because at this point, They lob Jonah overboard, and immediately the sea ceases its raging. In this moment, the sailors are now seized by a new fear, the fear of the Lord, as they have had a glimpse into the greatness of God. And the sailors' conversion at this point, of course, is completely ironic. Jonah's rebellion and attempts at running from God bring about the very thing he's trying to avoid, bringing God's message of love to the Gentiles and extending his grace to all people. Oh, and then Jonah's swallowed by a big fish. Pretty cool stories so far, right? That's just chapter 1. So how is this relevant to us today? And there are 2 areas I'd like to look at: the storm and Nineveh, the effects of sin and running from God. Let's talk about the storm. So God sent this huge storm to get Jonah's attention because Jonah was shutting him out and disobeying him. God sent the storm not as a punishment, but as a wake-up call. Jonah was turning from God and separating himself from the Lord. Every act of disobedience, turning away, ignoring God's guidance, every act of our sin has a storm attached to it. There are consequences to our actions and our inactions. Now, just to be totally clear on this, I am not saying that you're going to get sick because you robbed a bank. But I am saying that if you rob a bank, you are going to go to jail. Our difficulties are not always a result of our actions, but our actions do have consequences. The Bible does not tell us that every difficulty is the result of sin, but it does teach us that sin will bring us into difficulty. Now, I don't know about you, but I sometimes find myself falling into the trap of thinking that sin is only the really bad stuff, and therefore perhaps letting myself off the hook a bit too easily. I haven't murdered anyone or stolen anything lately, so yeah, I'm probably doing pretty well. But sin is much more pervasive than that, and it sneaks in almost unnoticed initially. Do you ever find yourself looking at other people's holiday snaps on social media, feeling a bit envious? Do you ever wander the streets of Southfields with the fancy houses on and finding yourself feeling a bit dissatisfied with your own perfectly good home? We have some very good friends who have moved to the countryside. They have a beautiful house with a huge garden, loads of space, a stunning view, and whenever we go and visit them, we pray on the way there and on the way back that God will protect our hearts from envy, that we wouldn't allow jealousy to creep in and infect us, that we would remain grateful for everything that God has blessed us with and not be tempted to become resentful, because, my goodness me, it is so easy to slide down that slippery slope. And if we make these little compromises in our lives, no matter how small or seemingly innocuous, they stack up. Sin gradually hardens the conscience and eats us up from the inside. It's like taking an addictive drug. Initially, it feels great, but it gets harder and harder to not do it again. And as these compromises and decisions stack up, they become like a great fog in our hearts and our minds, clouding our judgment and obscuring our ability to see and hear God. Jonah was so tuned out and distracted by his sin, he wasn't even aware that there were amazing things happening around him, that God was working on the hearts of the sailors on that boat. Not every storm or difficult thing in our lives is our fault, but like Jonah and the sailors on the ship experienced, our decisions affect others. Jonah's decisions are not just his own, and neither are ours. Our decisions affect those around us. It's just inescapable. Don't you if you remember that thing that we all went through quite recently, the global lockdown? I don't know if you saw any of the pictures of nature reclaiming spaces, deer grazing on the middle of massive roundabouts, big cats sauntering down past high street shops. Now, for a number of cities in northern India, they were treated to a surprising sight. Without all of the traffic and the pollution, the air cleared and the fog lifted, and suddenly they could see the Himalayas some 200 miles away for the first time in 30 years. We might even have a photograph of that, potentially. Don't know if you can make that out. Now, the mountains, they had been there all along. They hadn't changed. But the storm of the pandemic had changed the atmosphere and opened their eyes to a new view. Sin is like that polluting smog. It settles over us and sits like a blanket, choking us, blurring our vision, and blocking our ability to hear from God. When storms come into our lives, whether as a consequence of sin or not, they can wake us up to the truths that we would otherwise not see. They drive us towards God, clearing the smog and blowing the clouds away and changing the atmosphere. If you're feeling like maybe there are some habits that you need to break, maybe some unwise choices that you have made along the way, or that you would just like to clear the fog and see the Himalayas again, it's probably time to reset your compass. Not through your own willpower, but by asking God to help you reorientate yourself back towards Him. And it's something we all have to do regularly, and something we'll have a chance to do in just a moment. My final point is a challenge to us all about calling. Jonah had a problem with God and the job that God has called him to. He didn't like God's plan. He preferred to stick to his own. He doubted God's motivations and decided that he knew best. Do we let our own plans become more important than God's plans? Have we already decided what we're doing with our lives and are determinedly sticking to it? Are we prepared to trust God with our plans in the knowledge that He does know what is best for us? I wonder how this idea of calling strikes you. I wholeheartedly believe that every single person here has a calling to something. Even if that is simply to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbour as yourself. But what has God put uniquely on your heart? Some of us are being called to bring joy and positivity to our colleagues, some to be the kind soul in the school playground at drop-off, others to work with the vulnerable, some to work in ministry, others to be the person who is always so welcoming at church. Is there something that, deep down, you know that God has nudged you about, but you don't want to do? Are you resisting that summons? Now, maybe you've never heard God's call on your life. Maybe you've never asked God that question. Or maybe you've never listened to the answer. Are you going through life with your hands over your ears, just in case God is in fact calling you to something? Ignoring God's call didn't exactly work out well for Jonah, and it didn't exactly work out well for me either. When I first started to sense God was maybe calling me to ordination, I did an ostrich, and I completely ignored it. As God persisted and I resisted, I started feeling really disquieted. My spirit was troubled. I felt so sort of disrupted and disorientated. It even got to the point that I began to feel quite unwell. So reluctant was I to open my heart to the idea that this might be something God was calling me to. Much like the storm for the sailors, I too felt an enormous sense of release and relief from the moment that I gave voice to what I thought God might be saying, and the storm ceased. What is your Nineveh? What might God be calling you to? What might you be running from? Do you need to talk to God about it? Or perhaps you're a bit like me when you go to a pantomime. You know that point in the panto where they're looking for someone to call up on stage, and I sit there feeling horrified at the thought that it might be me, and then feeling quite disappointed when it's not. Would you actually love to have a sense of direction from God, but are a bit scared of what he might say? Do you long for a stronger sense of his calling on your life? We're going to just pause for a moment now, and I'd invite you to close your eyes. And we're just going to let this settle for a moment, to ask ourselves, do we need to reset our compass towards God? And to ponder, if we're ready to ask God the question, what are you calling me to? And as we're thinking about that, I'm going to invite the band to come up and start to play. And I'm also going to invite anybody who would like to come and kneel at the altar rails. And Steve and I will be available just to give you anointing. Now, we don't need to know why you're coming up, but we will be here just to help you reset, reorientate, and say a blessing over you. The act of coming up, of saying to God, okay, I'm ready to do something about this. I recognize that perhaps things have either gone a little bit awry, or actually I'm ready to hear what you might like to say to me. So whenever you're ready, if you want to come up and have a kneel, we'd love to bless you.